Okay, so here we are for our next instalment. We'd left it where the river badger, Brocklin, had rescued Zam and his companions from the rats, and he was telling them about the fact that they used to be kind, they used to be loyal and full of stories, but then they changed when they lost their leader. I wonder who their leader is. We might find out in this next bit. And I wonder what happened to make them change. Just before we go, that was a picture of Brocklin. A little bit closer there. Of our river badger friend. And he said he tries to keep the sewers clear and clean up the mess that the rats make. The water badger had been as good as his word, and soon they'd passed through the sewers and out into the river beyond. By the time they'd arrived at the North River Falls, Brocklin had told Zam all about the Pied Piper, who'd been the rats' greatest friend. He'd charmed them with his flute music, and they'd loved him. But then they'd come to Nightingale, and the piper had fallen in love with the Grand Duchess, and he'd lost his flute. It had all gone downhill from then. Brocklin guided his barge to the riverbank and helped them ashore. Ginger had been grateful to climb off the barge and away from that water. The sacks on the end of the broom handle had swayed as he clambered over the tumbles of boulders. And Zam stood on the riverbank and waved to the barge as it glided away, calling his thanks to the badger and to the sprites. Then, turning away, he'd caught up with Ginger and the sugar-spun princess, who was standing on one of the boulders. It was only then that Zam had seen they weren't alone. Standing a little way off was a giantess with long, flowing green hair festooned with mushrooms. I wonder who that is. The next chapter, chapter 20, is called Phoebe's Music. We start with a picture of Phoebe there. There she is holding her magic cello after she'd made her escape from the Clock Tower Square in Nightingale. Phoebe Limetree sat down on the boulder and looked out across the tumble downs. They were incredible. It was like sitting on a shore of a sea of stones. It had been a long journey from Nightingale, and as Phoebe had fled from Clock Tower Square, clutching her cello, she had heard the metallic clatter of the tin men behind her. She hadn't looked back. Instead, the Gruff and the cart had sped her through the maze of back alleys and winding streets until they'd found the road out of the city to Spindle Falls. Phoebe longed for home and for freedom, to be somewhere she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder because she was being watched. She had travelled through the night, the full moon above her like a silver lantern, until she had seen the safety of the blue thatched rooftops of her hometown. But Spindle Falls had changed, and as she skirted the edge of the town, Phoebe had been alarmed to see tin men everywhere, gleaming axes on their shoulders as they clanked down the streets. Next, she'd seen the posters. They were everywhere too, pasted on the walls, the doors and the window shutters. There she was, looking back at herself from those posters, her likeness captured by those copper-coloured beetles. And with a sinking heart, Phoebe realised that she couldn't go home. Rather than making her parents proud, she'd risked getting them all thrown into prison alongside her if the tin men found her hiding. She had no choice but to keep running, and the only way she could go now was into the Great Wood. As the sun rose over the falls, Phoebe had known she didn't have much time. She couldn't take the Gruff any further, so she tied it up beside the well. Then she borrowed a basket and filled it with anything she could find, cooling loaves from the back door of the bakery, carrots and sweet turnips from her mother's allotment, and a clutch of eggs from the chicken coop, and a warm blanket from the clothesline. Tying the basket to her back, Phoebe had set off into the Great Wood, heading north. Perhaps Troutwine was somewhere. She could find work and escape the tin men. She had to try. That had been 3 days ago, and now Phoebe's supplies had run out. She'd enjoyed walking from glade to glade, climbing the tallest tree she could find each night, and sleeping in its branches. She wasn't afraid, as she thought she might be, all alone in the forest. The trees seemed like guardians, and Phoebe felt safe among them. She listened to their gentle whispers, and when she reached out to touch their bark, a And then, when she slept, Phoebe had dreamed of bears and winged horses flying high above the clouds, looking down at the great woods below. At last, her stomach rumbling, Phoebe had emerged from the forest to find the lonely desolation of the Tumbledowns spread out before her. If she was ever going to get to Troutwine, Phoebe knew she'd have to climb down over this sea of stones. But first, she needed some music to lift her spirits for the journey. The cello had remained quiet in its case as Phoebe had walked, but now she clicked open the cases of the instrument and took it out. "Hello," it said. "I've had the most wonderful dreams." "So have I," said Phoebe. "I'll tell you about mine, if you tell me about yours, but first, let's play." "What a good idea," said the cello. So Phoebe played, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't forced to play a particular tune or piece of music. She just played what seemed to be inside her, waiting to come out. The freedom was wonderful. She played to the murmurs of the trees, the dabbled sunlight of the glades, and most of all, she played her dreams of dark-furred bears and magnificent cloud horses. The music swelled over the Tumbledowns and into the far distance. Wonder what this music's going to bring. And suddenly, a shadow fell across the boulder. Phoebe looked up and froze. Staring down at her was an enormous giant, with flowing green hair the colour of moss, dotted with sprouted mushrooms. The giant's face creased into wrinkles as it bared its fangs. Phoebe screamed, then leapt up and ran across the jumble of boulders in panic, trying not to bash the cello as she ran. She jumped from one rock to the next, sending others tumbling down over the scree as she did so. She glanced back over her shoulder. The giant wasn't chasing her. Instead, it was standing still, open-mouthed, a look of astonishment and disappointment on its features. Phoebe turned back and leapt towards the next boulder, only to see a girl jump out from behind it. She was holding a glowing sword, which she raised above her head menacingly as Phoebe landed. I wonder who this is going to be. Are our stories starting to link up a little bit? There's our picture of our giant. I must admit, she does look a little bit startled, that giant. "Where's your crew?" the girl demanded. The boulder wobbled under Phoebe's feet. "My what? Whoa!" Phoebe exclaimed as the boulder began to tumble and she lost her footing. Phoebe's arms shot out as she tried to steady herself, and the cello and the bow slipped from her grasp, sailing high into the air as she fell down into the ravine that had been revealed by the tumbling boulder. Phoebe caught a glimpse of the girl catching the cello and the bow before the darkness swallowed her whole. Picture of our part of the moment.